the 11th day, the 11th month, the 11th hour, bells were rung throughout the world. The war to end wars had had its day.
When we decided the theme of our Peacestock 2014, we decided on the security state. But who do we get? We had threw out some names, but we weren't sure. So we just mulled it over for a while. And then one day I was watching on the internet, I saw an interview with a fellow by the name of Ben Wizner. And I thought, man, that's a man we have to get. So I gave him a call, and it's amazing how easy it is to get a hold of him. I bet the NSA likes that. So I called him up and told him about Peacestock, and he said, you know, that sounds interesting. I'll check my schedule. So a few days later, got a call back from Ben. He says, yeah, I'd like to come. So I said, wow, you know, this is great. I did a little jig, and I was actually up north ice fishing on a cold northern lake. And I suppose after that time, the NSA started watching me and to see how many fish I was catching, too. But we're glad to have Ben here. We know that he's been very busy since 9/11. He's the director of the ACLU Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. He's been litigated on many civil liberties cases and abuses. He's also Edward Snowden's legal counsel. And the title of his presentation today will be Something to Hide, Dragnet Surveillance, and the Future of Privacy. So please give a huge Peacestock welcome for Ben Wizner.
Thanks, Bill, for that very warm introduction and for picking up the phone and calling. If you don't ask, people don't have a chance to say yes. One of the things that I've done a lot of in the last year is help Edward Snowden decide which of the hundreds of invitations he gets every week he should accept. Every reporter in the world wants to ask him questions. Every community group wants to have him speak. What you don't know is that he also helps me decide which invitations I should accept. And when I told him that I had been invited by Veterans for Peace to go to an event called Peacestock, he said, you know what, that sounds like it's really worth your time. And that's an audience that I would like for us to be connecting with, because veterans who care about peace will understand me and my motivations and what I'm doing. And he especially wanted me to thank you for your service to the country. So let me thank you for filling a room like this on a Saturday afternoon. It's just terrific for me to be here in this community. It is in rooms just like this one, here in Minnesota, in Maine, in Montana, maybe even in Manhattan, where we begin the work of taking back this country from Goliath. It's been quite a remarkable year since the world was introduced to Edward Snowden. If one were going to try to sum up what it is that we've learned in this year, in a single sentence, one would fail, but one might try anyway. You might say that we've learned that the law has not kept pace with technology. Or a longer sentence, you might say that in particular surveillance technology, tracking technology, has outpaced democratic controls. Now this is something that many of us who have watched the surveillance state were worried about before Edward Snowden came to us with boxes full of evidence or thumb drives, as the case may be. We had watched over the last decades as an architecture of surveillance was built up all around us, mostly with our consent, sometimes in secret. Think about how the world has changed in the last few decades. Remember a time when it was possible to live lives of practical obscurity, where unless you did something to attract the attention of the powerful, they did not know or particularly care who you were or what you were up to. Think about just everyday activities and how they've changed. Remember when you used to, maybe some of you still do, write letters with ink and paper, put them in an envelope, lick it closed, put a stamp on it, and drop it in a box. That letter was protected not just by the seal on the envelope, but by the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. If the police wanted to open that letter and read your mail, they needed to go to a judge and they needed to get a warrant to do that. How do we communicate with each other now? We type words on a screen, we press a button, we don't really know how it gets from one place to another, but for almost all of us, it goes through a gigantic technology company, is stored in a massive server farm somewhere, and that information is never, ever deleted. It essentially exists forever, and the government can get it more easily than they could get that letter that you used to stick in the mail. What about the telephone? Some of you will remember when it cost even less than a dime to pick up a phone. It had a cord on it. It was attached to the wall. Maybe you even remember phone booths where you could go in and close the door for some privacy. Well, even in New York, there aren't that many of those anymore. Pretty hard to find an old-fashioned phone booth. Instead, most of us have something that looks a little bit like this. Last year, the New York Times published a good story. It said we should stop calling these things phones. Phones are about 1/1,000,000th of what these things are doing. We should call them trackers. You have decided to put a police officer in your pocket. Not just a police officer, but the world's largest corporations, to make it very easy for them to know where you are at all times. You store so much information on these kinds of devices. They're constantly communicating with cell phone towers and satellites and mapping and tracking your location. Once again, that information is stored in big databases and never deleted. Think about shopping. Some of us still shop in bricks and mortar stores. We go to stores and walk around the aisles. We might even browse in bookstores and look at books and not buy them. But if you're doing any of that shopping online, not just what you purchase, but what you don't purchase is being tracked and really stalked. Again, not only by the company that you're shopping from, but from hundreds of other companies that are trying to link your activity online to your actual identity so that they can learn more things about you and target better advertisements to you. Driving in a car, remember when we used to talk about the freedom of the open road? If you just wanted to escape, you might get into your car and take a drive. Think about all the ways that you're being tracked when you get into a car right now. If it's a new car, the car is probably doing it itself if you have a GPS system installed. But any kind of car, even my 1975 Volvo, that you basically need a hand crank to start. I'm still driving through automatic license plate readers that are snapping a picture of my license plate every single time I pass, hundreds or even thousands in a second, linking up those databases with other regional databases in the area and sometimes around the country, funded by federal grants. And what do you have? You have a GPS tracking database that is being sold to us as something that will catch kidnappers, but instead is actually creating a comprehensive map of where we all drive. I could go down the list, reading the newspaper. Again, if you read the newspaper online, I am telling you there are hundreds of companies whose names you've never heard that are following every single click and trying to associate that click with other information about you so they can find out who you are, what you like, and what it is that they can sell you. Now, why is it that they're able to store all this forever? Because digital storage, which used to be very expensive, is now incredibly cheap. Just 30 years ago, it would have cost a company or the government $100,000 to store a gigabyte of data. Now the cost is somewhere around 10 cents, which means that it's trivial, the cost of storing all this. And this is why you see both big companies and big government building massive data facilities like the one that the NSA is constructing in Utah, so they won't ever have to delete anything. Now, this trend towards collecting more and more is obviously fueled by other forces in our society. On the government side, 9/11 and the threat of terrorism the inflated and hyped threat of terrorism, I should say, has essentially been fuel for the national security state to inflate their budgets to grotesque proportions, and to use this essentially to construct this apparatus of surveillance. And their attitude has been, we will collect everything we can, and the authorities will follow. We'll worry about the law later. We're going to do this because we can do it. But even if the security state didn't exist to do that, the dominant business model on the internet right now is for big companies to provide us services for free. I should put free in quotation marks. You don't pay a monthly bill to Google if you use Gmail or their other services. You've probably never paid Google a cent directly, and yet Google is making billions and billions of dollars a year from their real customers, who, as you heard before, are advertisers. There's a funny cartoon that I saw of two pigs sitting in a barn, and one turns to the other and says, "This place is great, we don't even have to pay rent." And the other one says, "Yeah, the food is free too." Right? So it's a very good rule of thumb that if you are not paying for something, you're not the customer, you're the product. The real customer, as we heard before, are the people who Google is sending this information to, who then use that to construct more and more intimate portraits of who we are. And they know a lot. Sometimes they know things about us that we don't know about ourselves. They certainly know things about us before we know them ourselves. There was a very well-known story from the Target Corporation. I'm sure it made news here as well, but Target wanted to know which of its customers were pregnant. It was a very important piece of information for Target, because there are periods in our lives when we change our habits. When we might change our buying habits or other habits. Pregnancy is one of those times. They thought if we could get pregnant women into our store, and they saw that we don't only sell microwaves, but we sell huge packs of diapers. We sell all these things in bulk. They can get all their things done in one place. We will build customer loyalty and grow our business. So they had a team of mathematicians, and they gave them a huge pile of data, and they said, tell us which of our customers are pregnant. It turned out to be not such a hard problem for the mathematicians. They were able to associate various purchases, unscented lotions, cotton balls, things that I wouldn't have known, but that correlated with pregnancy. Those flyers that you get in the mail from Target are actually targeted. They're not all the same. So that if they have a reason to think that you're pregnant, they'll put diapers into that one, whereas mine won't get it. So Target sends pregnancy-themed advertising to the home in the name of a young woman, 16 years old. Her father is outraged when he sees this, calls up Target and says, why are you marketing pregnancy products to my 16-year-old daughter? He called back a few weeks later and apologized and said that he didn't know everything that was going on in his own home. What message did Target take from this? Their message was not, we should not target pregnant women. It was, we need to be much more careful about how we do that. We need to put the diapers next to a lawnmower. We need to make these advertisements look like they're totally random. We need to conceal how much we know about people, because if people realize that we know if they are gay or straight, if they have a mental health problem, all of this kind of information that we would consider very, very intimate ends up being a pretty trivial math problem to a big company that is sitting on a huge pile of this kind of data. So it's worth keeping in mind. There are all these behaviors that we would not accept if we saw them in real life. If you were walking around a store and someone stayed 6 inches behind you with a clipboard, taking notes on not just everything you bought, but everything you looked at, you would call security. But actually, this is what goes on just as a matter of the daily internet economy. Now, I hope that you won't think that I'm a Luddite and that I am anti-technology and that I'm saying we need to go back to a time where everybody drove a 1975 Volvo without GPS. No, I think, listen, we benefit tremendously from these technologies. It was very useful for me not to have to print out directions, but to know that this thing would tell me how to get here this morning. Even an annoying social media site like Facebook creates certain efficiencies, allows people to share in ways that are important, certainly can be useful for activism if people deploy it in the correct way. So what separates these very dangerous uses of technology from the better uses of technology? How do we ensure that we can get the benefits of GPS tracking without creating these nightmarish databases of ruin being stalked by other people, by companies, by our government? The answer to that has always been law. Law helps us mediate these bad outcomes from better outcomes. And the bad news is that law has done a miserable job in the realm of new technology and surveillance, simply because it hasn't, or maybe it's beginning to, but it really hasn't caught up with a world in which, for the first time in human history, it's technologically and financially feasible for the government, and not just our government, but other governments and corporations, literally to collect and store all of our communications, all of our movements, our associations, all of this information that no spy service in history, no matter what its resources, was ever able to assemble. So how is the law doing? The law is not doing very well. When it comes to our rights as consumers against corporations that would mine and exploit this data and even use it for discriminatory purposes, we don't have a baseline consumer privacy law in this country. We're one of the few democracies not to have a law like that. Essentially, the law that regulates your rights is the privacy policy that you will never read. If you were to read every privacy policy of every internet program that you used, you would spend something like 50 whole days of every year reading privacy policies. So it's not a solution to say that just read what it is that they say they're going to do. If you like it, say yes. If you don't like it, say no. And the government will just regulate to make sure that they don't lie and break their policy. That's not enough. We need to be able to do somewhat better than that. What about with respect to the government? Well, we talk about at the ACLU how we need a 21st century Fourth Amendment. Now, the 18th century Fourth Amendment was written very well, and if it were interpreted correctly, we wouldn't need a 21st century Fourth Amendment. But in a series of misguided at the time and absolutely appalling now decisions in the 1970s, the Supreme Court essentially said, information about ourselves that we voluntarily divulge to third parties no longer enjoys constitutional protection. We have no expectation of privacy in something that we've already shared with another person. Now, this is a very bad description of human behavior. Every day we share things with other people that we wouldn't want to share with other people. I tell one friend something and I don't want my mother to hear that, I can tell you that. But I also might tell the government something that I don't want my friend to hear. Or vice versa, tell my friend something that I don't want the government to hear. I mean, our lives are so contextual in that way, and we have a very ingrained sense of that context, even if we don't always realize it. But in those cases, essentially, the Supreme Court said, if you dial a phone number, you have to know that that number, who you're calling, is being shared with a phone company. And if it's being shared with a phone company, why can't the government just go and get it too? Very easily. Now, on that foundation, this is called the third-party doctrine. Apply that to the world that we live in now. How much of our lives do we every day divulge to third parties? Almost every intimate detail of our lives is voluntarily divulged to third parties if it's held in servers by internet companies, if it's stored in a digital cloud. And the Constitution has not caught up with this modern reality, although I'll say later, I think there are a few recent decisions of the Supreme Court that are reason to believe that the court might be waking up to this problem. The principal act of Congress that protects our electronic communications privacy, our email privacy, was written in 1986, before there was a World Wide Web. It is wholly out of date with modern practices and uses, and that needs to be reformed. And what about oversight? What about congressional and judicial oversight of how this information is collected and gathered? Well, I can tell you We spent a lot of time in the years after 9/11 when we had intuitions about what the NSA was up to. Most of this we got because people, even long before Edward Snowden, who were in the government and were absolutely shocked at what they viewed, went to courageous investigative journalists. And so we were reading as early as 2005, it should have been earlier, about the NSA's massive warrantless wiretapping programs. We went into court as soon as we heard about these programs, and every single time we tried to challenge a government intelligence surveillance program. Here's what happened. Now, of course, they would say to the press and the public, everything we're doing is legal. But they said something very different to the courts. In the courts, they didn't defend the legality at all. They said, these plaintiffs have no right to be here. They have no evidence that they themselves were subjected to any of these surveillance practices. Without that evidence, they don't have standing. They're not entitled to get that evidence through discovery because it's a state secret. And therefore, neither they nor anyone else has legal standing to bring this challenge. And as a result of that, before Edward Snowden, it's not enough to say that we never won any of our challenges to intelligence surveillance programs. Those cases were not heard. And as recently as a few months before the first Snowden leak, the Supreme Court decided in a 5-4 decision that the ACLU's case against an NSA dragnet surveillance program could not survive this standing requirement because, in an opinion by Justice Alito, he said, it was based entirely on speculation. Well, that speculation looked a lot better a few months after that decision, and that decision looks a lot worse than our speculation. Congress has been an absolute joke, and anyone here who has ever dealt with members of Congress who are on the intelligence committees, with very few exceptions, will realize that they serve the intelligence community much more than they serve the public. You know, the idea behind setting up intelligence committees was that you would have certain members of Congress who would get more information with higher security clearance about what was going on, and they would do oversight for the rest of us. And I guess I should stop here and acknowledge that constitutional oversight of secret government programs is actually a hard issue. It's not a simple issue. If you acknowledge the legitimacy of any government secret, as I think most of us do, that there are some things that can't be divulged, then you have the question of how you can be a self-governing country where the people don't have critical information. And so one of the solutions that we came up with in this country was that we would have these special committees of Congress that would be eyes and ears of the rest of us. You know, we would vote them into office, but they would see things we couldn't see, and they would stand for us. Now, the problem is, if you look at political donations to members of Congress, and you will see that the people who were on the intelligence committees have by far the most contributions from the contractors that stand to gain most from very lax oversight. You know, the Booz Allens of the world, the Blackwaters of the world, they give very disproportionately to the people who end up on these intelligence committees. And even the strongest voices on these intelligence committees, even people like Senator Wyden, who is a very, very strong voice for reform, are unwilling to risk their position on those committees by sharing classified information with the public. You'll remember that now notorious exchange where Senator Wyden asked the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, is there any kind of data that the NSA collects and stores on millions of Americans? And the answer he gave was, no, sir, not wittingly. The correct answer being yes. Now, we most often discuss this episode as one where James Clapper lied to Congress, but that's not quite right, is it? Because Senator Wyden knew the answer to the question. The other members of his committee knew the answer to the question. So the only people who were lied to were us, the American public. So this is an example not just of the executive branch lying, but of the congressional branch failing, allowing that kind of false statement to stand uncorrected. Now imagine if you're Edward Snowden and you're watching all of this. You are young, you're idealistic, you joined the military out of a misguided sense that you should go to Iraq because that's where your country was going to war. Luckily, his legs were broken in training, so he didn't have to go over there and either be killed or commit war crimes. You joined the CIA, you joined the NSA, You are still motivated, you're still idealistic, you want to help your country, you want to use your skills, and what do you see? You see this sprawling mass surveillance system that is being constructed and deployed totally in the dark. You see your superiors not only hiding this information from the public, but actively lying to the public about what it is they aren't doing. You turn to groups like the ACLU or the Electronic Frontier Foundation and say, what are they doing about it? Are they taking these cases to court? You look and see what happens when we try to challenge these programs in court. You nod when we write these complaints about what it is that the NSA is doing because you know we're right. And then you see the courts not do their constitutional job, but instead dismiss the cases. And I will tell you now, Snowden was watching the very first conversation he and I had, which was exactly a year ago this week. One of the first questions he asked me was, do you have standing now? Do these disclosures mean we can go to court? Can we now get courts to consider these cases? It was one of the first things he wanted to know. It was why he wanted to talk to the ACLU. It was why he did what he did. He did what he did not to subvert the democracy, but to revitalize it. He did it because he wanted courts and Congress to do their job. And to me, that's one of the great ironies of this, is that it took someone who was willing to break the law and risk his life in order to revive energetic oversight over our intelligence community, which we haven't seen since the 1970s. So what was it that was so troubling to Edward Snowden that he was willing to really risk his whole life, his whole future, in order to make sure that we knew it? He saw that the NSA was collecting information about every single phone call that every American makes every day. Don't buy this, it's just metadata. Metadata is surveillance. The metadata is much more valuable to the government than the content of the conversations themselves. If they had the content of hundreds of millions of conversations, they wouldn't know what to do with it. The metadata, they can analyze it, they can run sophisticated algorithms on it, they can map your entire life with that metadata. That's what they want, not the content. He saw that the NSA was not only collecting all this information itself, but was going to the huge technology companies in Silicon Valley in two ways. It was going in the front door and saying, here, we have a court order. You need to turn over all this customer data to us. That was something called the PRISM program, and there were other programs. But the front door wasn't good enough. It was also breaking in the back door. It was looking for vulnerabilities in these technology company systems, and instead of telling them about the vulnerabilities, it was exploiting them. It was hacking into communications between the company's own servers so that it could steal all of the raw transmissions that were going through there. It was doing something called upstream collection, where it would tap underwater cables where all of the world's communications pass and redirect it into NSA storage facilities. It was systematically working to undermine the encryption standards that protect all of our data in all kinds of ways, that protect our medical data, our financial data, our credit card. And it wanted to do that so that it thought it alone would be able to break the encryption on those communications. Well, the problem is if you weaken it for one attacker, you weaken it for all attackers. You can't exploit vulnerabilities without leaving them open for other people to use them. And this is, I think, one of the very important lessons of the last year. And this is not just something that ACLU lawyers say. This is something that cybersecurity experts say. We have to make a choice at some level about what's more important to us. Is it more important to us to protect the security and confidentiality of our communications from hackers, from foreign governments, from malicious attacks? Or is it more important for us to be able to conduct mass surveillance of our own citizens and people around the world? You have to make a choice, because the way that you conduct that mass surveillance is by creating vulnerabilities and exploiting them. Richard Clarke, who was President Bush's chief terrorism advisor for a while, testified in Congress a few months ago that it is more important for us to protect our communications from China than it is for us to be able to attack China. And this is really a critical point, and this is why it was important for Snowden to show this isn't just a US issue, why he wanted to show about surveillance practices that were going on around the world. He saw that he, as a 27, 28, 29-year-old analyst, sitting at his own terminal using a program called XKeyscore, could put in the phone number or email address of anyone in the world, as long as he had a valid phone number or email address, and suck up all of those communications in real time, including if he had the email address of the President of the United States. Now, people laughed at him when he said that and said that can't be true. But I remember reading a New York Times article in 2009 about how an NSA analyst was reprimanded for doing that with President Clinton's email at the time. It's absolutely something that the only thing that prevents them from doing it is that they're not permitted to in their jobs. There are internal policies. But we know how good they are at supervising their employees, right? So good that a 29-year-old walked out with everything, and they still don't know what he took. Again, it was absolutely to him scandalous, not just, or not even primarily, that all of this was happening, but that it was happening without the people in a democracy having a seat at the table, being consulted, getting to say, we want to do this or we don't want to do this. To him, and he has said this in the press, he thinks primarily his job is done now. He gave us the information. It's our decision what it is that we're going to do with that information. Are we going to say that we accept these practices, that they're necessary, that the government's talismanic invocation of the words national security will shut down our minds and our critical faculties and we will follow them like sheep? Or are we going to say, you know what? You've all gone too far. We're not buying this game anymore. We don't think that you should be able to construct the biggest surveillance time machine in the history of the world and have that kind of power over us. So I think it is worth talking for a minute about what Snowden thought and what I think is so dangerous about giving any government this kind of power, if I haven't already convinced you of that. One thing is that in a world where everything that we do and say, everywhere that we go, everyone we talk to, where all of that is stored forever, it will chill what it means to be a human being. If you have the constant feeling of being observed all the time, I am sure there are people in this room who have hesitated before doing certain internet searches in the last year because they worried about what might happen. If I type in these words, if I type in Al-Qaeda, am I going to end up in a database? But this is really just the tip of the iceberg. Imagine a world in which surveillance drones with Argus cameras that can capture an entire city in real time are recording everything, not so they can look at it now, but so that they can press rewind later when they need to do that. I really feel that it will not just chill people from being activists, from taking on the government, but just even the feeling of walking through the park holding someone's hand when you know that that's being recorded. I used to say, the government has a legal theory. Their legal theory is that as long as a human being doesn't look at it, nothing has happened. That they can intercept and store all of our communications. If they just put them in this box over here, they don't have to ask anyone for permission until they go and start poking around in this box. Well, the same would be true if they put remote cameras in everyone's bedroom and say, don't worry, we're not going to look at it, so it's not significant that the camera is there, only if there's a complaint that a crime occurred in this bedroom. And as we know, unfortunately, crimes occur in bedrooms across this country all the time. We will only look at it then. Would you say that that's not chilling to have the camera above the bed, even if they have to go to a judge to look at the footage? I used to use that as a sort of bottom of the slippery slope argument, but then one of the Snowden documents told us that the NSA's British equivalent, GCHQ, actually has a program where they intercept webcam images from Yahoo of millions of people. Many of them are sexually explicit, and then just store them in a database, right? So that world, in some sense, is already here, and we do need to worry about chill. But I worry about more than chill. I worry about how this information is going to be used. And I mean that in this sense. The justification that we're given for why NSA needs these extraordinary powers and authorities is terrorism, that we have this new kind of enemy and they're going to kill us, and this is the only way that we can stop attacks. Well, The problem is that mass surveillance doesn't stop attacks. Their predictive skills are much worse than they think they are. And that's for obvious reasons. There just aren't that many terrorists. And when you record hundreds of billions of data points and store them in massive databases, it doesn't matter how sophisticated your algorithms are. Figuring out who is going to set off a bomb at the Boston Marathon is not really a job for computers. What those computers are really, really good at is figuring out what you're going to buy. But they don't have to get that with a lot of specificity. If they're right half the time, they're going to be very wealthy. But when you're talking about targeting individuals, you have to be right all the time. They're not good at that. Now, what they are good at is forensic analysis. What I mean by that is they're very bad at stopping attacks. They're very, very good at solving crimes. Think about if the police had drone surveillance of all cities at all times. So a liquor store is robbed. Let's just go to the tape. We'll rewind it to 2:30 in the afternoon. We'll see which car pulled into the parking lot. Our license plate scanner will show us the image. We've solved that. Now, I think there are probably people in our society who cheer that rather than fear that, right? Why shouldn't we give law enforcement that kind of power? And the answer to that is right in the Constitution. The very wise people who wrote the Bill of Rights were much more worried about a government having too much power than they were about a bad guy getting away in one of those situations. You can't read the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, or 8th Amendments without realizing they were trying to make things a little harder for law enforcement, not easier, because they knew that all power would be abused, and they knew that a database like this will be irresistible, not just to spies, but to cops. In the Snowden documents, you see examples of the DEA trying to get into these NSA databases to solve drug crimes, of the FBI trying to get in to solve other kinds of crimes. It won't be long before local cops on the street with smartphones will have access to these mass surveillance databases. And that's a society that's going to look very, very different. You don't even have to be under suspicion yourself to end up punished in a world like that. And let me give you just one example that is not exactly on point, but I think is enlightening. And that's the example of Professor David Petraeus of the City University of New York. He used to have a different job. He had a job until one woman sent a nasty anonymous email to a second woman. The second woman was alarmed. She went to the FBI, and the next day, the FBI is pouring through thousands of private emails that David Petraeus had written, not just to his mistress, but to other people, and he's out of a job. This is what happens when we collect everything, because someday someone might do something suspicious and we want to look through it. Again, I don't want to make the argument that these databases don't work for that purpose. They do. That's the problem. The problem is they give government just too much power. Now, the scariest iteration of this is the one that Snowden himself has described as turnkey tyranny. And that scenario goes like this. The government is sitting on information, not just the government, one small part of the government, the likes of which no totalitarian spy agency ever had. Now, we are not East Germany under the Stasi, and I am not here to say that we are. Our society is free in a lot of ways, but what's protecting that freedom? What's protecting that freedom in the intelligence community are a set of internal policies that people like Snowden are afraid can be cast aside. That if there's another catastrophic terrorist attack, if there is any kind of war event on our homeland, that the people who run these databases will blame these controls and say, you know what? The reason why we didn't stop them is because there's all these cumbersome rules that we have to follow. It happened after 9/11, where the FBI and the NSA said, and the CIA, there was a wall that prevented intelligence and criminal sharing, and we've got to tear down this wall, and so we got the Patriot Act. But if you take this to the next level, where our surveillance system is hundreds of times more complex and comprehensive in 2014 than it was in 2001. It develops so quickly. We're basically, handing blackmail keys to a couple of people who we have good reason not to trust. Now, you can believe different versions of this. You can be worried about different versions of this. Some people aren't terribly worried about it at all. Some people are waiting for the smoking gun that shows that they are, tracking specific journalists or tracking human rights workers, or, they want it to look like the 1960s where the FBI was trying to blackmail Martin Luther King. And I try to explain, this is a different situation. It's a different set of risks. Back then, they had to decide who to follow. They had to devote resources to following those people. If they wanted to know where Martin Luther King was, they had to have 3 cars of people following him around in shifts. If they want to know where we are right now, they just call the phone company. Right? They don't have to do that kind of targeted surveillance because they're getting everything about all of us. And that information will not stay locked up if we collect it. So I don't want to be entirely pessimistic because I really think the last year has been extraordinary. I told you the first question Edward Snowden asked me was, do you have standing now? And here's why he asked that question. The very first article that the Guardian newspaper published based on the Snowden documents was an article about it, included this document, it included an order from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to a company called Verizon Business Records, ordering them to turn over every day all of the phone metadata from their customers. Well, one of their customers was the ACLU, and that very same week, the ACLU took that document, it was a ticket to federal court, and we filed a lawsuit saying that this program is illegal and unconstitutional. And every judge so far has agreed that we have standing to bring that case. So for the first time since 9/11, we have federal courts that are scrutinizing the legality and the constitutionality of these programs. Now, we may not win them all. We'll win some, we may lose others. There's already been a Republican federal judge in Washington, D.C., who called this particular program almost Orwellian and almost certainly unconstitutional and issued an injunction. But I do think that having these issues decided by courts, having courts, have the evidence and the courage to adjudicate these disputes, in and of itself justifies what Snowden did. If that were the only result of his act of conscience, was that federal courts are now finally looking at this and deciding whether these programs are legal, I think he would still be a hero. But it's not just the courts. We're seeing actually an incredible bipartisan coalition in Congress, comprised of liberal Democrats and many Tea Party Republicans who are suspicious of the government having too much power. And there is a liberal-libertarian alliance in Congress that is forming. It is not people on intelligence committees, right? It's not the people who are in the pocket of the intelligence community, but we've seen some very impressive votes already in the House of Representatives where majorities have voted to strip the NSA of some power. So I think really the only question that we have now is, in the next year, will we see comprehensive, historic, bipartisan surveillance reform in Congress, or will we see some more cosmetic version of it that takes small steps but is totally inadequate? Either way, it will be the first time since the 1970s that Congress restricted rather than expanded the authority of the intelligence community and added some oversight to the process. Again, if that were the only result of Snowden's leaks, I would say he did his job. He's a hero. We haven't had this kind of debate in this country or around the world in decades. We've seen actually even the President of the United States, who initially was quite annoyed and offended that this debate was even taking place. The first thing he said is, these programs were approved by all 3 branches of government. Don't worry about it. Well, actually, he's right. They were approved by all 3 branches of government. That was the problem. Now, as soon as the public is part of the conversation, you see all 3 branches of government scrambling to respond to public outrage. These programs are not surviving public scrutiny. But even the president appointed 2 panels, his own review board comprised of former intelligence officials and some law professors, which wrote a scathing 300-page report saying that the NSA was out of control, and a new privacy and civil liberties oversight board that held hearings as well, and essentially concluded the same thing. This is a remarkable moment. And finally, outside of government, one of the intended audiences for Snowden is a technologist, he's a geek, he spent his time in the tech community. He has more faith sometimes in technological solutions than he does in legal solutions. He believes in solutions that you can write into computer code and that will work not just against one government, but against every government, end-to-end encryption of communications, for example, making the kind of mass surveillance that the NSA and the GCHQ do impossible, or at least much, much, much more difficult and more expensive. We've seen the major technology companies already massively improve their security, see NSA for what it is, an adversary. One very important, I think, result of these disclosures is that it's driven a wedge between companies like Google and Yahoo and Facebook and the NSA. When those companies are working hand in hand behind closed doors, you can kiss privacy goodbye. But when we have them adverse to each other, they can be a check and a balance. I happen to think that we need those big technology companies with all of their power and all their wealth to help to protect us from government surveillance. And paradoxically, I actually think we need strong government regulators to help protect us as consumers from the depredations of those big companies. So what we want is for them to see each other as adversaries and not just to be in bed together. And if that was all that Snowden had done, I would say he's a hero, and what he did was justified, and we should thank him. So, I want to just tell two short anecdotes now, and then I really, really want to open this up for questions and answers and conversation. If you just wanted to hear me talk, you could probably go on YouTube and find some similar version of this. But what makes this a unique experience is that we'll talk to each other. And I'll hear what your concerns are, what questions you have, and then we can engage with each other that way. I said before that we have very weak privacy laws in this country compared to some other countries. Now, there are some very unusual and arcane exceptions to that. Now, one exception for that is that we have very, very strong privacy laws for video rental records. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Why do you think that is? In 1987, Ronald Reagan appointed to the Supreme Court someone named Robert Bork, who ended up not being confirmed. He was too controversial a nominee, even for the Senate at that time, and his nomination failed. But during the course of that nomination hearing, the Washington City paper went to Bork's video store. At that time, we used to go to video stores and rent VHS tapes, remember? And they obtained his rental records. Now, there was nothing scandalous in them. He had very boring and sort of traditional and slightly highbrow taste in movies. But 535 members of Congress saw that piece and said, "Oh dear God." Right? They imagine reporters going into their video stores and finding out what movies they watch. And I should tell you, just as a side note right now, that when we litigate these cases involving obscenity and pornography, one of the issues in these cases is community standards. It's just part of a strange Supreme Court test that they've advocated. And when you do discovery and you find out, the truth is that that pornography watching in red America is a lot higher than it is in blue America, right? The communities that say that they are most against it, if you actually track it, you will find, anyway, that's a side note. So this is why we have very robust privacy law for video rentals. Let me tell you one more story. In 2012, the Supreme Court decided really a landmark case. It may turn out to be the most important Fourth Amendment case in a generation, although time will tell. And that case involved whether the police need to get a warrant to attach a GPS device to a car and follow it around for an extended period of time. In this case, it was someone accused of being a drug dealer in Washington, D.C., and the police had tracked him using a GPS device over 28 days. Now, the government thought this was a very easy case, and you can understand why. The government said, how can he say he has an expectation of privacy in where he drove his damn car, right? He was driving around on the public streets. You know, we could follow him around. How can he say that that's private. Now, of course, the argument on the other side is the one that I said before, that what was really protecting our privacy in the past was not law so much as cost. If the government was going to follow you around for 28 reasons, they had to have a really good reason to want to do that, whereas now they can do it to all of us sitting in front of a laptop, and that actually shifts power in ways that really do implicate constitutional concerns. Now, in the oral argument before the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roberts asked the government's lawyer, are you essentially saying that you could go into the Supreme Court garage and attach GPS devices to all of our cars without having to ask a judge for permission? And the government lawyer said, well, yes, Your Honor, that would be no different than our having teams of FBI agents follow you around all the time. This was the wrong answer. Right? And all 9 justices of the Supreme Court, albeit for different reasons, concluded that it was a search under the Fourth Amendment for the police to put that device on a car. So what do these stories have in common? What these stories have in common is that when powerful people realize that they have some skin in the game, they start to worry. But I hope that what you take away from these remarks and from this last year is that in this new world of mass surveillance, of dragnet surveillance, of collected-all surveillance, every single one of us has skin in the game. Every single one of us has skin in the game. So with that, I want to thank you again for being here, and then I'd be happy to take questions. And I'll repeat all of them. Is there a microphone that we could pass around, or should I just repeat all the questions? What do you think? Is there an extra microphone?
Mike Larry, the outdoor mic, and then otherwise you can come up here.
Let's see if this one right here.
This one here?
No, that's just for the camera.
Oh yeah, what about this one? What if people stand here? Because it's easier if people come up to a microphone. My suspicion is that there will be many people who would like to ask questions or make comments. And although I am a free speech advocate, I probably will limit the questions and comments to about 90 seconds. And I'll do that in a way that doesn't seem very speech protective. But I'm warning you now.
So this is a quick question relative to your last comments. And thank you so much for coming. It's really an honor to have you here. The recent Supreme Court unanimous decision relative to cell phones.
Right.
And when you talk about skin in the game, it's very interesting that these 5 white Catholic male justices have zero empathy for women. That's right. But they're very worried about their own cell phones. So can you talk about that as another example of what you just mentioned?
Yeah, so this is the decision I was talking about a minute ago was a decision from 2012, but it's absolutely right that just 2 weeks ago there was another landmark Supreme Court decision, also unanimous. There's a doctrine under the Fourth Amendment that allows the police, when they arrest you, to search everything on you without a warrant. It's called a search incident to arrest. And the rationale for this is that you might have a weapon on you, and so they do it for safety, or you might have some way to, throw your drugs down a drain before they're able to get them. Now, the police had been using this doctrine in order to not look for a weapon, but to reach for one of these, and you can imagine why. In one of these cases, they pulled someone over for a broken taillight, opened up his cell phone, looked at all his photos and videos, and charged him with an attempted murder, based on photos and videos that they had found on the phone. And given how easy it is for the police to make custodial arrests, they can arrest you for not wearing a seatbelt, they can arrest you for jaywalking, in some states they can arrest you for not having ID. You're essentially opening up your entire life that you have on the phone, and again, this phone, it's not just what it stores. For many people, it's a portal to information that's stored in a digital cloud. It might have their bank account information, their credit card information, medical records. So the Supreme Court says, in a very impressive 9-0 opinion to the police, literally, it said, here's what they should do if they want access to that information, get a warrant, right? It was something that could have been written by us, but I think the point is exactly right, that, how do you convince these guys that they need to protect us? You convince them that they need to protect themselves. And what do powerful men worry about? They worry about getting caught in infidelities. They worry about getting caught in cheating on taxes. They worry about getting caught in all kinds of ways. I mean, if I could scrutinize the records of every member of Congress, I could indict every member of Congress. There's no question about it. I mean, there really isn't. Cardinal Richelieu said the same thing in France 200 years ago. He said, "Give me 6 lines of the most innocent man, and I can hang him." Right? You know. So I do think that's right, and I mean the optics of the Supreme Court this year. I think that's exactly right. These 5 Catholic men ruling on these issues, and also in the religion cases. You know, you saw a 5-4 decision where it was, you know, 5 Catholics telling 3 Jews and 1 other Catholic, "Don't worry about Christian prayers in town hall meetings. It's not a problem," right? I do think, and law should not come down to empathy. But in many situations, it's who tells the better story about what's going on that results in, you know, who wins and who loses.
My question is, Senator Franken's up for election. Where does he stand on these kind of privacy issues, and how could we put pressure on him to get better?
Well, I would say that his record, like the record of many people in Congress, is quite mixed on these issues. He has shown some interest in the corporate data policy issue, more so I think than in the government surveillance, and has been interested in issues like the way that companies track our online activities and behavior and giving consumers more control and protection for that, and he's been pretty admirable on those issues. He's not yet a reliable or eloquent voice on civil liberties in this context, and it may be that he feels that he has to get reelected first before he can play a stronger role here. I honestly don't know the answer. The second part of the question, you know, how do we put more pressure? You know, I think that you know, and I don't know what the politics are in Minnesota, but if they look like the politics in other parts of the country on this, this is not a left-right issue. He shouldn't worry about being tarred as a weak Democrat on this issue, given that there are very strong Republicans who are on our side on this issue. You know, the author of the Patriot Act, a Republican, Jim Sensenbrenner, just wrote a guest article in the ACLU's magazine saying, "I wrote the Patriot Act. That's not what we meant." You know, and we need to amend this thing right now. And if they don't agree to amending it, they're going to lose it. Sensenbrenner wrote that in the ACLU's publication. So I do think that if people are close to Franken and he can get a more nuanced appreciation of this. What is this coalition? This is not just us hippie activists trying to pull him to the left so he won't get reelected. This is a much more interesting moment in our national politics.
You mentioned the ACLU's work, and you mentioned the Committee of the President. Are there any other credible groups that are looking into this and making recommendations?
Yeah, I think so. If you don't know about, if you're very interested in this, if you're interested in this on a much more detailed level, you know, a level of more specificity and than I gave today, you know, I would say, you know, the National ACLU's website has huge amounts of information. Also, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF.org. They're based in San Francisco, and they've been just a fantastic resource on these issues. The Center for Democracy and Technology, the Electronic Privacy Information Center. There is a big coalition of groups and experts that have been working on these issues for a long time, and you know, you will find yourself not with too little, but with too much information. And maybe I mean, I think that one thing that the ACLU tries to do is to communicate this information on a non-technical level in a way that you know, my mother can understand, right? Yeah. Whereas some of these other groups are a little bit more focused on the technical side, but you'll find no shortage of information.
Yeah, Ben, speaking of skin in the game, almost everyone that I've talked to, reasonably bright people, say, I'm not worried. I haven't done anything. Why should I worry about this? I went to Dunkin' Donuts and got some coffee.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
Well, I think there's, I probably have 100 answers to that question. You know, you hear it all the time. I have nothing to hide because I've done nothing wrong. I mean, first of all, it's an absolutely false statement, because I hide things all the time that aren't wrong. You know, there's nothing wrong with singing in a shower, right? There's nothing wrong with sleeping with your wife. Or using the toilet, but these aren't things that I do in public, right? These are things that I do in private. You know, most people have curtains on their homes. Most people wouldn't share their email addresses or credit card statements with everybody else, even though they've done nothing wrong, right? They understand that we need to have some space where we can be who we want to be outside the prying eyes of the community and the government. But I would also say something else, that, you know, what I tried to talk about before may be a little bit abstract and attenuated for some people, but mass surveillance isn't just a threat to us as individuals, it's a threat to us as a society. We risk creating a world where the government simply has too much power, where companies have too much power, where everything that we do is tracked, where the information that we receive is controlled. So some of these threats are not, they're going to take me away. But, you know, we're going to lose our sense of being a free society in the way that we are. So, you know, again, I don't know who that convinces. You end up veering into science fiction territory when you describe the world that will be in 20 years without the right kinds of democratic controls. But I happen to believe it's true. And even if we're wrong, what if I'm wrong and the NSA is mostly right? What if really we're not headed towards this dystopian surveillance state? Well, the only thing bad that will happen if you listen to me is that we'll have a few more checks and balances in place. But what if they're wrong and I'm right? Then we are allowing this awful society to be created without debate. It's almost like the debate about climate change, right? I mean, even if the science were 50-50, we'd be crazy not to take steps, because the cost of being wrong on one side is a catastrophe, and the cost of being wrong on the other side is a cleaner planet. I mean, it's right, and so Yes.
The CIA briefs the president every day. How can it happen that after we had a screw-up with the Germans a year or more ago, that they just had 2 more screw-ups in the last week, and the president is clueless about what's going on in an agency that's under his control in his branch of government?
Yeah, I honestly don't know the answer to that. I think my guess is that within the CIA, you know, this kind of thing is so routine and so trivial. Of course they're trying to get as much information as they can about our close allies and what they're up to. That's what they do. That's what they're sent out there to do. And the problem is that they don't have the same political sense about, you know, how disastrous that is in the current climate with the NSA. But look, this is what the U.S. does in Germany. By the way, this is what France does in the United States or in Israel. And it's not just the U.S. doing this to China and China doing it to the U.S., right? Democracies spy on each other. The problem is that in the context of, you know, this massive global debate about our overreach, you know, the idea that they would risk our diplomacy in order for, I mean, I think actually, let me say one more thing about it. I think that it shows how out of whack our priorities are, how much our intelligence agencies are just addicted to information without realizing that the information is about outcomes. It's not about itself. We want to know these things because we want this result. And so they sacrifice this result to get the information. They're willing to risk our relationship with Germany over nothing. I mean, to get a little bit of information that really could have read in the newspaper about a German parliamentary investigation. It's so idiotic. You know, having said that, you know, I spent 10 years suing the CIA for torture and rendition. I'm much less offended by them trying to poke around in Germany to find out about a parliamentary investigation.
How does the president not know about it?
The president doesn't know a lot. No, I mean, we're talking about a part of government that survives any presidency, that is more powerful than the presidency in a lot of ways, right?
I retired as an Army JAG officer about 1.5 years ago, where I represented Guantánamo detainees. I'm still on the Balul case before the D.C. Circuit.
I've seen you there.
In the course of that, researching the right to know, as that being one of the issues in Balul, went back to the Vietnam War and really began studying some of the things that came out of that. from people like Westmoreland and other generals who said basically that we were stabbed in the back by the press, the media, because they're the ones who created the, gave the information out to the dissenters. And with hindsight, though, I think we can say that the dissenters, people like Pete Seeger, were far wiser than the likes of General Westmoreland. Had we listened to Westmoreland, we would have still been there, or we would have been bankrupt by now. So I think a greater danger, but coming out of there, they said next war, we need to have media control, information control, and I think that has been internalized within the military, as you would no doubt know, the various embedded journalist tactics and all this other stuff, so that they really created this protective wall around the people making these very important decisions. Probably people here were part of the Tet Offensive, and because of General Westmoreland and his deceptions and whatnot, and I'm part of the Sam Adams intelligence group also, a lot more Americans were killed during the Tet Offensive just directly because of Westmoreland's lies and deceptions. So there's an immediate reason why we should be concerned that we are protecting our military leaders so much with this wall of secrecy. And I think that's an argument that hasn't been provided enough. Now, I will say, amongst the groups you mentioned, one more is coming into being, the Institute for the Study of American Militarism. Former CIA people and some journalists, to make that same argument that the Constitution is not a suicide pact, rather it's our greatest strategic strength because we do have, or are supposed to have, this oversight. Right. And I think it's an argument that's been overlooked too much. That
I do want to know. The question is in there, and I do want to. First, I want to say that I was at Guantanamo the first time Belul was brought before a military commission, and pulled up a handwritten sign in English that said boycott on it, and he stood up in English and said boycott, boycott, boycott. I'm glad you're still fighting for his case. That was a nonsense charge. I mean, this is someone who was a propagandist, not a war criminal.
So I guess my question then will be, going back to say the Hedges v. Obama lawsuit. There's a perfect example of how the law of war, which is really not a law, but customary law of war, can be used now under Section 1021 to suppress free speech, chill speech.
What I take from that comment, and it's a really important one, is that secrecy operates in multiple ways. So secrecy both creates the necessary environment for government crimes and misconduct to occur, but then it also creates the environment for people who are the wrongdoers not to be held accountable. Right. Now, the Guantanamo military commissions were essentially set up to provide a forum so that we could punish people for their alleged crimes without having to hear them talk about our crimes against them. And they actually built a courtroom with a soundproof glass wall so that you can't hear what's going on in there. And everything is played on 45-second delay, just in case one of these guys starts talking about the way that he was tortured. That's what it's for. That's what Guantanamo is for. It's a way to sweep this stuff, under the rug. And in that sense, secrecy and ending secrecy, having transparency, is important, not only because it allows us to hold people accountable, and if we don't hold them accountable, they'll do these things over and over again, but it's important to prevent allowing an atmosphere like this to occur. So someone, I can't remember, said it best about torture. When the lights go down, the hoods come on, the gloves come off, right? This happens when you turn the light out. It doesn't happen in the light of day. Without secrecy, there would have been no torture. Because of torture, we now have a secret court system, and it's this terrible feedback loop for democracy. So transparency, is a way for us to get at misconduct and to get at accountability.
Brief statement and question. Nothing the government does particularly surprises me. Any student of history can see that this has been a pattern since before the times of William Randolph Hearst. It's just the tools are getting more sophisticated. And earlier someone said, or you were talking about dystopian future, getting into the realm of sci-fi. There was an article in CNN Money not long ago where they were talking about automobile manufacturers just kind of realized, like, oh yeah, the computers we're using to upload Pandora and everything to the internet, there's no firewall protecting that, and it's directly linked to the programming, the chips that, yes, you can hack it and mess with the brakes, mess with the steering wheel. We're already kind of getting there, but it was used in the context of money, like, oh, these poor companies are going to have have to spend all of this money now to fix it.
To add
so that you'll
security,
be
which should have
safe.
been built in before they deployed this technology in the first place. Yeah.
We're already kind of steamrolling in that direction. And my question is, and this in no way calls into question Snowden's actions, but as far as like being in Russia, what have his experiences really been there? Because I mean, and Putin's not really the most trustworthy person either. And you know, and in America, we're supposed to own our government, but everyone knows that in Russia, government owns you. So I'm curious as to what his experiences have been there.
Yeah, no, and so first I'll tell you what he has told others, and then I'll say a little bit more about that. You know, as you know, he was flying from Hong Kong. He had a travel document to go to Ecuador. The only way that he could get from Hong Kong to Ecuador without passing through a country that had an extradition agreement with the U.S. was to fly from Hong Kong to Moscow to Havana to Quito. He never got past Moscow. He didn't have a valid passport. It had been canceled just before he left Hong Kong. He was taken into a room upon arrival in Moscow, confronted by people who were surely Russian intelligence agents. They essentially said to him, "Are you here to cooperate with us?" And he said, "No." And they said, "Are you sure?" And he said, "Yeah, no." Had he said yes, he would have been put into a limousine and driven to a dacha somewhere and given, you know, fine foods. Instead, he was said, "Okay, go to that cot in that room for 40 days." He was stranded in a corner of the airport. He made handwritten applications to 24 countries for asylum and eventually was allowed to get into Russia. They have essentially allowed him to do as he pleases. The public statements that they make about that are essentially true. He still lives a very cautious and quiet life in the sense that every news organization in the world wants to know where he lives so they can follow him around all the time. Every government, including our own, wants to know where he is at all times. So he, you know, I have met him there. Lots of people have met him there. He can move around the city. He has, you know, said things and written things in the media that are critical of the Russian regime. He wrote an op-ed in The Guardian in which he called Putin a liar and said that they're engaged in disturbing surveillance. He said in his interview on NBC with Brian Williams, he criticized Russian censorship laws as they relate to social media platforms. So he's speaking, you know, quite openly. He would prefer not to be there, but I want to make a point about this, that accepting humanitarian asylum somewhere is not endorsing the policies and practices of that country. You know, during the Bush administration, many thousands of people from around the world got asylum in the United States because they were fleeing from torture. They were not endorsing Abu Ghraib. They were not endorsing the CIA's black sites. They were not endorsing Guantánamo. They were escaping from, you know, persecution that would be unjust. Now, the question with Snowden is, what do you think should be done to him? If you think that he should go to prison probably for the rest of his life, then you say you should come home and face the music. There's no real defense to what he's done in U.S. courts. If you agree that that would be a grotesque response to his act of conscience, sadly, there's no place where he can be right now. We're working on it. I have lawyers in lots of countries working on this. There's no place where he can be right now except Russia. It's awkward. The optics are terrible. It's not, you know, right? It's odd to have a message about freedom and liberty and to be in a regime that is less free than the one that you fled from. There's no question about it. But there is no alternative except his disappearing into a solitary confinement cell for the rest of his life at the moment. I just want to be clear about that.
That's what Hillary wants. Yeah.
She's running for president.
There you go, sir.
Yes,
sir. For you,
Mine is a different nature. It's a personal experience, which is relevant, and you may not need to elaborate, but I can tell you most of it. My family and some people in Washington State do know this. I was taking my first teaching job at Washington State University in social science, and the textbooks usually have chapters on public opinion and propaganda. I was sharing, I have a whistleblower, I was sharing with the students, reading didn't have electrical things, then what do you call them, cablegrams, between President Roosevelt in here and Kimmel and Short, our senators in our placement, not senators, they're officials in Japan, and in Pearl Harbor, and ambassador crew in Japan. I was reading it to them. After the class, one of my students went to a psych professor and said, Dr. Irish is propagandizing the students. That psych prof then goes to the president of the university, who calls me in without any examination or further and asks me to resign right on the spot. And of course, I refuse to do that on the spot, and I don't want to take more of your time by elaborating. I'll be glad to share it, but I don't want to take the time of these other folks to do it. We cannot have a democracy if we do not know what our country is doing. Now, this is in the late 1940s. The war was over, and I was telling them things that the average person don't know, and you may still not know. We had sunken Japanese ships before Pearl Harbor. We were sending arms to Britain and France before Pearl Harbor. And the other thing about having the nuclear weapons, you did not need those. They said we need to have them. Japan had already initiated talks for peace. So I was trying to give history, honest history, and we cannot maintain a democracy without doing that. And this is what we have a problem in education. Often the text and so forth, it makes it different if you tell the truth. So I stopped there, but it was a personal experience, and I got my PhD at Washington, University of Washington, and a lot of other things afterwards in Latin America. But this is the case I experienced, and comment what you like, but they send me to prison now. I'm 95, that's okay.
Yes, I know. I'm thinking we have to find a way to take advantage of your courage and your age to get you to do something illegal and dare them to punish you. Yeah. But thank you for that statement. You know, actually, Daniel Ellsberg said to me the other day, you know, he never made very much money in his life, and he said my retirement plan was always prison. Right? Yeah.
Well, Paul Wellstone and Sheila Wellstone were on government watch list for teaching college while being political activists during the Vietnam War. So this is Ben's first ever visit to Minnesota, so let's show him some love.
Thank you.
George Orwell said, in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. So I want to thank you for being a revolutionary and convey that message on our behalf to Mr. Snowden. And then I've got two questions. Number one, the perception...
Actually, maybe you all could give me a T-shirt to bring to Snowden? Okay, in addition, but yeah.
Two questions. The first question, the perception of the ACLU is that of being a liberal, left-wing dogma. How does that affect your ability to function under that perception?
I think candidly it does affect it. And I think that part of it is that the ACLU works in so many areas. And so some of those areas are real social hot buttons for people. And so people who would be very inclined to be our allies on issues of surveillance and privacy, you know, are deeply offended by positions that we take about, you know, government-sponsored religion in schools, or about rights for gays and lesbians and marriage equality, or about reproductive freedom. And so it has in the past made some of this kind of coalition work more difficult. I will say this, at the level of the people who do the work professionally, we work extremely well with conservative organizations. You know, I don't know whether they have done all the work that's necessary to convince their constituency that we're not, you know, going to, you know, steal Jesus from them or whatever it is that they think, right? I mean, that we exist to protect religion too. We want to protect religion from government and protect government from religion. But it has at times, and you know, sometimes I'll go into a room where the group is conservative rather than liberal, and I'll spend every single question will be about the Second Amendment, and you know, it's exhausting. to be in that environment. But we're working on it. You know, one of the first interviews I gave after becoming Snowden's lawyer was with Ron Paul for his TV show. Now, we don't agree on everything, but we certainly agree on this.
And then, sir, thank you for your service. Here's my personal story. I've been on the receiving end of illegal government contractor domestic surveillance since March of 2002 by my former employer, Teletech Holdings. With response to the one question about Senator Franken, he is the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee Chairman for Privacy, Technology, and the Law. So he should actually be a point man on all of this. And a year ago, last June, he said, but I can assure you this isn't about spying on the American people. That's a ridiculous statement. A month after that, he made a comment in a CNN op-ed stating that, and I'm going to paraphrase, that there's a gag order with the private corporations that make 70% of the intelligence operations budget on the senators, actually, and the private corporations. And he said that basically if the senators, which Bernie Sanders concurred and Ron Wyden and Mark Udall, if they told the American people what was really happening, they would be arrested. So what kind of chance do we have?
Well, I actually hope that those senators will also decide that courage is contagious, and they'll look at Snowden's example and say, if someone like this, who is totally obscure, who has no protection or privilege, can take this risk, maybe I, an elected senator who is not plausibly going to be prosecuted, can stand on the floor of the Senate, invoke senatorial privilege, and tell the American people what's being done to us in our name. A boy can hope. Right. Yeah. It's okay. Go next.
Next person over there, though. That guy behind you. Guy behind you.
Why behind him?
I'll ask my question until.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. It's very short. You actually opened up the issue a little bit before. So I was just curious because I was watching a news item on TV and they said his German lawyer, and I'm just wondering if you could give us some idea what other representation he has.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I first got in contact with him in July, as I said, of 2013, and at that time we didn't know where he would be next. Russia had not yet offered him permission to stay. The very first lawyers that we needed to bring on the team immediately were criminal defense lawyers in Washington, D.C., to prepare for the possibility that he might end up back in the United States and face trial, but in any event, to have people who could be the direct interlocutories with the government about possible negotiated outcomes to this. So there are very well-known Washington, D.C. criminal defense lawyers who have handled cases. I guess there's never been a case quite like this, but cases involving these statutes before. It became clear that we also needed counsel in Europe for a number of reasons. Number one, he has long said that he would rather get asylum in a democracy than be in Russia. I was getting contacted every day by politicians from various countries. There's no way that if I'm getting contacted by a Danish politician, I know whether it's Paul Wellstone or Scott Walker. I just have no idea who it is. So we needed to have people in those countries who understood the lay of the land, the politics. And so we started with Germany because Germany has been the most active, and there is a German lawyer who I worked with in the past on CIA rendition cases. We also have lawyers in France, in Spain, in Iceland, in Switzerland, in Brussels, who are sort of part of the team to help us. Again, not just to work on the question of asylum for him, but also to help him participate in surveillance reform issues in those countries. He doesn't think this is a problem that can be solved by the US Congress. This is something that has to be solved by free societies acting together around the world. And so we built out our team in that way. There may be other people we need for various things. Maybe someday he'll decide that he wants to write a book, and we'll need lawyers to help him with all the legal complications that will be associated with a process like that. The truth is, nothing in my experience prepared me for directly for this kind of role. I've just been trying to make the best decisions possible as situations arise. I've made mistakes, so has he. That's inevitable. The stakes are really high, and the situation is very complex. But that's and there's another lawyer, in Washington, D.C., named Jesselyn Radak, who is herself a former Department of Justice whistleblower. She was a whistleblower in the John Walker Lind prosecution. And she has been an expert and consultant on the protections or lack thereof for whistleblowers in the system, and has sort of, been a very powerful and skilled defender of the decision that he made as the only one that was actually open to him. Yes, sir.
Yeah. I have a question about 9/11 itself, and whether Mr. Snowden has any opinions on the official, so-called official American view of 9/11.
Mr. Snowden was 18 on 9/11. He actually was going to a job at Fort Meade that day. He believed his grandfather was at the Pentagon that day. It turned out that he wasn't. His response to 9/11 was to try to join the Special Forces and go fight in the Navy SEALs and go fight in Iraq. So whatever views he has about that would have developed much later. But I can't speak for him on this question. He and I have not discussed it. He's not sitting on a mountain of evidence that he can look at. Whatever he gave to journalists. I doubt there's anything from that period, just based on what it is that we've seen. So I don't think that I'm going to be able to shed any light on this question.
All right, thank you.
These fellas have been in line quite a while.
Yeah.
Shall I?
Yes.
Move forward so we don't get feedback.
Thanks for being here. We're really very grateful. I just wanted to ask how important are the actions of individuals? It seems to me that we have a group here who works very, in many ways, very cohesively throughout much of Minnesota. And we do just about everything that we can think of, including having you here. And many of us also tend over a period of time to see little change. And I want to have your thoughts about how important individual actions are. I'm thinking of those of us who frequently do valuable work with groups but are frightened and afraid to take a risk. And it seems to me that somewhere there needs to be some encouragement for individual action. I'm going to start by giving you my T-shirt.
This T-shirt's going to Moscow. But I do want to make a comment about individual action, because what did we learn this year? We learned that one person, 29 years old, obscure, unheard of, didn't graduate from high school, could change the world. Could become an epic, historic figure. Now, we can't all be that. We won't all be that. But one person did that. One person can. I guess what I would say, to be a little bit more concrete, is that we can't be observers of this moment. This isn't just about decisions that will be made in Washington and in the UN and in Berlin and in Brazil and in Silicon Valley. The issues of mass surveillance that we're talking about now at the national and international level are all coming to our backyards. As the cost of collecting information and storing it goes to nothing, this is going to be something that every sheriff and cop is involved with. Again, you already see it with technologies like license plate readers. You see it with military equipment being shipped to local police departments, so that police departments have tanks now. So one thing that I would say, the ACLU affiliate in the state of Washington has been working very hard with city councils to get ordinances where local communities essentially say, before we will take any new weapon or surveillance technology from the federal government, from Homeland Security, from the Department of Justice, from the DEA, we're going to have a debate in our local community and we're going to have a vote on whether we want it or not. Because typically what happens is that this information is just pushed out into our communities by the federal government, which is giving it away for free. The cops themselves say, sure, another toy, we'll take this, a drone, why not? And the problem is that the citizens, the local citizens, are not consulted. So I wonder whether there are creative ways that people here could go to local officials, the ones who pay the sheriff's salary, who pay the police chief's salary, and say, we don't want to see this new architecture being built in our community without our having a say in it. Doesn't mean you might vote yes. You might hear them say, these are the benefits of license plate readers. We think that we can manage the risks through things like shorter retention periods, better policies, and you might say, let's let them have this. I happen to think that if with the right policies, that technology can be a useful one if you have the right, no one has the right policies. But why not use the power that you undoubtedly have, which is the power in your most local community, to try to make a statement there. And what if 200 communities around the country did that? Now, there was a time after 9/11 where communities were doing symbolic votes against the Patriot Act. Now, obviously, you can't change the Patriot Act in your city council, but the fact that a couple hundred city councils were, issuing these proclamations was very important for those of us who were working on the issue at the federal level. But this, I think, would be even more concrete than that. So that's one possibility. I wouldn't call that individual action. It's going to require group action.
I hope you'll understand this to be a friendly question. I received...
I will now.
Okay, good. I've received legal assistance from the ACLU affiliates more than once, and I'm very grateful for it. Earlier, there was some discussion of ACLU being demonized by elements on the right and building relationships there. ACLU has also been criticized from the left for being AWOL or being on the wrong side of corporate personhood and corporate free speech issues.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's a good rap or a bad rap, but I wonder if you'd care to comment on that, given what you've said about Google and Verizon and so on and so forth.
Yeah, now again, we haven't taken a position on corporate personhood. It is true that the ACLU, as a constitutional organization, has not always been in the camp of campaign finance reformers, because we do think that money that you spend on your own political campaign is speech. We do support limits on contributions, so we're not against limiting the amount of money that you can give to political candidates. We do think that limits on what a political candidate can spend violate the First Amendment. Take a look. You can see the brief that we wrote in Citizens United. It does not endorse the position that the court actually took. Our position is more nuanced on that. I'm afraid to say that my personal position on this question is more cynical than it is principled. And that position is that we will never be able to stop committed billionaires from putting whatever money they want into political campaigns, even if they do it illegally. What happens afterwards is that the FEC gives them 2 years later a slap on the wrist. They pay a $15,000 fine, and they've moved on. But I do think that some of the proposals to limit campaign speech have been problematic from the ACLU point of view. And we would like to see much more public financing of political campaigns, and we would like to see better limits on contributions to political campaigns. But this Supreme Court is completely in the pocket of corporations that want to control elections and control our future. So I don't think there are a lot of prospects on it. Look, I will say one more thing. This is an issue where, like many other issues, where people within the ACLU disagree. we're fond of saying, if you agree with us 80% of the time, you should be a member. If you agree with us 50% of the time, you should be a board member. Right? A lot of these issues are hard. That's one that's hard. Yeah.
I've spent many years teaching children and young people to make video and to have some tools to evaluate all the media they consume more critically. And so I've got this long interest in the murky way that old free speech standard, you free speech unless you shout fire in a crowded theater, and the way that gets interpreted with the media. And it seems like that's kind of been used with the WikiLeaks and Snowden. You did this, you caused, I'm just curious how
Say a little bit more about what it is that you
it's
mean.
like, it seems to me that that's been an argument used against Snowden and against Bradley.
That basically what they're doing isn't speech so much as it's incitement or provocation because they're harming national security.
Yeah.
I mean, I think so. I think, by the way, that from a legal standpoint, WikiLeaks and Snowden stand in very, very different situations. Whatever you think of WikiLeaks, and there are mixed opinions about them, they're a news organization and they're a publisher. No publisher has ever been charged criminally in the United States for publishing information. No newspaper has ever been charged. WikiLeaks, now there has been a criminal grand jury that's been looking at WikiLeaks, and I think that they were trying to come up with something that they might have done that was beyond publishing. Did they conspire with Chelsea Manning to get the information leaked? But you know what? Bob Woodward conspired with Deep Throat. I mean, that's what journalists do. They conspire with their sources to get information out. So I think that it would be atrocious if charges were to be brought against Assange or WikiLeaks in the United States. And, I haven't heard a plausible argument made that is likely to happen anytime soon. Snowden, on the other hand, clearly broke the law. Now, I think that the law under which he's being prosecuted is unconstitutional, the Espionage Act of 1917, but there's no question that according to the letter of the law, he broke it. He was in a position of authority. He had a security clearance. He signed a standard form saying that he wouldn't divulge this information. There's a law that says that people in his situation cannot give national defense information to others who are not authorized to receive it. That is law breaking. Now, it's not law breaking that should result in an espionage prosecution. It's not law breaking that should result in life in prison without parole. It's not law breaking that should result in a trial where he's not even allowed to argue that the information was improperly classified, that it shouldn't have been withheld from the public in the first place, that the result of the disclosures is historic reform, not harm to national security. The regime that he's being prosecuted under is an unjust one, an unfair one. The statutes that he's charged under are unconstitutionally overbroad. But I don't think there's a great argument to be made that he didn't violate any law by doing what he did. I think the argument is that the value of what he did justifies his action and means that he shouldn't be punished severely for it. But he's never argued that he didn't break the law. He's never attempted to make that argument. Right.
Bridget. What's your turn? Bridget is next.
Oh.
Okay.
Well, I've been here a little while.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we got to break the male voice a little bit. Yeah. But that's not why I'm asking. But the puzzlement to me is I heard, of course, Hillary's remarks in relation to Snowden, and they were appallingly based on misinformation and seemingly ignorance. I mean, I heard it on Amy Goodman, what she was saying, and it seemed atrocious to me, and I thought to myself, now I'm an old nun in Minnesota. That's who I am, an old nun in Minnesota. And it seems that I found out what was the truth. Why couldn't she? I mean, it's like the comparison there, and I thought, where has she been? What happens to her that she couldn't be informed at least as much as I was, from Minnesota? So I don't understand it. What happens to a person like that, that they get into misinformation?
Yeah, well, or rather, I think that what she does is she answers a different question than the one that's asked. She says he could come back here to the United States and defend himself in a court of law. Well, that's true in one sense. He could come back and have a lawyer. But again, here's a story that Dan Ellsberg told me about his trial. You know, he was the first person who was ever prosecuted for espionage for giving information to the press. Now, that case never resulted in an acquittal or a conviction because the judge dismissed the case because of the government's totally outrageous conduct, including offering him the FBI director position during the trial. But during the trial, Daniel Ellsberg took the stand in his own defense, and he wanted to explain why he had done what he did. And this was a rehearsed moment. He had kept back his best public explanation for this moment, and his lawyer at the appointed time said, Mr. Ellsberg, why did you give the Pentagon Papers to Neil Sheehan of the New York Times? And the prosecutor said, objection, and the judge said, sustained, meaning that was not relevant. He didn't get to tell the jury why he did it because it wasn't relevant to any of the elements of the offense. What was relevant was that it was national defense information, that he knew it, and that he gave it to someone who was not authorized to receive it. You know, he can plead for mercy at the sentencing stage. The same thing happened in the Chelsea Manning trial. She was not allowed to give that information until it was time for sentencing. And a lot of good it did. The government asked for 60 years to life, and she got 35 years.
You know, we said that, you know, lives were killed because of what, you know, I thought there were some other lies. I'm not referring to
I think she said there were other lies. She said that he could have raised his complaints with the Inspector General or with Congress. That would have been an interesting phone call. My name is Edward Snowden. I'm calling you up on the Senate intelligence community because I want to report to you about programs that you've approved in secret. Right? And he did actually raise these concerns with inspectors general. There were all kinds of lies. I have very, very, very strong doubts about any of the claims that are being made about harms to national security from these disclosures. I think actually the press has been super cautious in the way that they have published these documents. And keep in mind that it's the press that's making these decisions. You know, Snowden hasn't published any documents. He gave them to journalists. Those reporters and their editors, often in consultation with governments, are making decisions about what to publish and what not to publish. And I think they've been making responsible decisions about what to publish and what not to publish for the most part. So.
Yeah, Ben, I have to allow one more question, but you can allow more if it's up to you, but if you're maybe getting hungry too, but anyway.
One more and then I'll hang around.
Okay, anyway, I want to call on Gary. He's a friend of mine. He's a lawyer, and I don't want to get on the bad side of lawyer. All right. So Gary.
You have me to talk to.
First of all, I'm a proud card-carrying member of the ACLU.
All right.
Going back to the days of the 50s, you couldn't say that, but anyway. Given what's happened to Chelsea Manning, given Ms. Clinton's comments about what she wants to happen to Snowden and other government officials, I'm concerned about Mr. Snowden because he's a hero of mine. Could you give us your idea what's in store for him relative to asylum, relative to being prosecuted?
I have to be a little bit cautious here for reasons that you understand. But the first thing that I want to tell you all is that whatever image you might have about his exile in Moscow, he's doing very well. His morale is high. As he said a year ago, his biggest concern, can you still hear me? His biggest concern was that these disclosures would be ignored, that people would shrug and move on. On the contrary, you know, he's seeing countries around the world engage in this really historic debate. He's happy about that. He is in regular contact with lawyers, friends, journalists, supporters. In some sense, he's more socially connected now than he was when he was living in Hawaii or Geneva or Japan, when he was in these undercover jobs and couldn't talk to people. It's not like he was embedded in a community of friends and family that he was just snatched out of. So he's someone who is very happy to have 3 computer screens open so that he can have 3 conversations at the same time. I've been over to visit him. I'll go again. When I went, I thought, wow, this is going to be so important for him to get the visit. But it was really just a continuation of the conversations that we had been having. And I thought, I'll keep my visits more limited because it's more of a hassle for him. So he's okay. You shouldn't think about him as someone who is, in in house arrest in a hostile country. He's someone who is living the life that he chose. He expected consequences far worse than the ones that he's suffering right now, or as he put it to us, this actually isn't a very bad posting when we were there. As far as what his legal prospects are, I would say there's considerable distance between what the government thinks the correct outcome is here and what we think the correct outcome is here. It won't surprise you that the government speaks a slightly different game in private than they do in public. They would be willing to consider something much less than the maximum of what he's facing. But he doesn't believe that he should come back to this country a felon and lose his civil rights for an act of conscience. To him, if he thought that would help the reform effort, he would do it. But he thinks that part of what he wants to show is that you can fight back against this kind of power and not submit to it. And I think that every month and every year that will go by, his position will get stronger, the government's position will get weaker, and before long we're going to have an opening. What that opening is, whether he'll be living in Iceland or in Germany or back home in Maryland or somewhere else in the United States, I can't say now. But I also couldn't have said a year ago that we would have made this much progress in our first year. So, but just know that he is watching this debate closely. He is really grateful for all the shows of support that he has gotten. When I go back and tell him about this and just how warm the response was that we got and that he got, he'll be gratified. He'll write something very droll like, "That's positive." Yeah. Yeah. But thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Wow. And we have a couple more gifts. We have a couple more gifts from you. First, Wayne Whitman here has a gift for you. You want to say something?
Yeah, I'm a disciple of David Harris, and if David can give him the shirt, I want to give him the hat.
Okay. And here's a gift from Veterans for Peace for coming to Peacestock. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ben.
How did you make that connection?
Yeah. Well, I actually didn't learn who Snowden was until you did. That day when The Guardian published that lovely video that Laura Poitras shot of Glenn Greenwald talking to Snowden in the Hong Kong hotel room. But I had heard about Snowden before. I knew from my old friends Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald that they had been in contact with an anonymous source who claimed to be a senior intelligence official and who had information that he thought the public needed to see. I knew they were flying to Hong Kong to meet this source, even though we didn't know his name and they didn't know his name. So shortly thereafter, a few weeks later, it was Glenn Greenwald who put me directly in touch with Snowden when he was in the airport in Moscow and introduced us over encrypted channels. And that's when I started acting as his lawyer. Had I been involved with Greenwald before? Yes. Well, I had mainly been involved with Greenwald as a source for him when he was really beginning his journalism career, moving from the practice of law to covering civil liberties full time. Some of the issues that he covered were issues that I was working on, about the government's no-fly list, about the rendition program, about the state secrets privilege, about surveillance. So we got to know each other quite well in that capacity. He interviewed me a number of times. Same with Laura Poitras. I had given her legal advice in the past about her problems with government watch lists, about her filming of a movie at Guantánamo. We had been in touch about a lot of those kinds of things. But, he knew the risk he was taking. And I think that in almost every way, the results of his actions have exceeded his expectations. He lives freely. He has complete access. If you want proof that he can do whatever he wants, he used that computer to type an op-ed that criticized Putin's surveillance practices and called Putin a liar. No, he has complete freedom of movement and action where he is. That doesn't mean that he should go on Russian television every day and criticize his hosts. That's not something that you expect of someone who's living under a grant of asylum. But he doesn't feel constrained, and he certainly has full access to information.